A very good afternoon once again to all the distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, as we assemble for the second session of the day. May I now have the privilege of inviting Dr. Pavan Kumar Goenka, the Chairman in Space, to chair and moderate the talks on the topic of space economy, policy perspective. Sir.
Good afternoon. I hope you all had a very nice lunch and fully rested for 90 minutes of very in-depth understanding of the space sector. I'll go in there. The session is loosely titled Space Economy Policy Perspective. I'm privileged to be moderating this session. What we will be doing in this session are 4 speakers who will talk about various aspects of space economy. In fact, the theme that has been decided for this SELM has 3 keywords: economy, responsibility, and alliance. So the 3 presentations by outside experts will cover these 3 aspects: economy, alliance, and responsibility. So let me just say how the session will go. I will be making a presentation first on what's changing in India in terms of the space sector and the new direction that India is taking. A lot of you have asked me about what's happening with Indian policy. It was alluded to earlier in the first session. I will go into all the gory details. After that, we will have Mr. Herman Moeller, who will talk about framework for quantifying and measuring space economy. Herman has joined the European Space Policy Institute in Vienna in September 2022. As its new director, he is leading the European think tank on space, responsible to develop approaches to European space policy and provide recommendations to European decision makers and institutions. After Herman, we will have Mr. Ian Christensen. Ian will talk about the new space and responsibility for sustainable and safe space operations. Ian is Director of Private Sector Program at Secure World Foundation and has 8 years of professional experience as a consultant and analyst focused on international and domestic commercial space, satellite, and aviation markets. Then we'll have a presentation by Captain Vishal Kanwar. Vishal. He is Executive Director of Aerospace and Defense, PwC India. He is also working with ISRO and INSpace on the decadal vision for Indian space sector. That work is just about getting completed. He'll probably talk a little bit about that work and much more, titled New Space Economy in the G20 Countries and Opportunities for Collaboration. We have 90 minutes for this session. The way we are planning it, each of the 4 speeches will be about 15 minutes. After that, we will have time for 2 or 3 quick questions to the speaker. And then in the end, we'll probably have 15-20 minutes left for overall discussion. And I look forward to some very engaging discussion on these 4 topics. So with that, I will start my speech, and I request Secretary DOS to pitch in any time that he wants to add to what I'm saying or anybody else is saying. So my presentation is titled Evolving Indian Space Policy Framework and Outlook. So I just wanted to put up this slide first. It is in the bunch of papers that have been given to you, but you may not have looked at it. The reason I'm showing it is just to show the length and breadth of ISRO in India, how far-reaching the various centers are. There are 17,000 employees that ISRO has. 13,000 of those are technical resources. There are 14 key centers and many more autonomous labs and bodies that they have. 123 Indian spacecraft missions have happened so far. 89 launch vehicle missions have happened. And ISRO has launched 422 foreign satellites of 34 countries from India. And when I came into space sector, I was quite impressed because from outside, one generally does not realize how far-reaching ISRO's capabilities and infrastructure is. So space sector reforms in India happened about 3 years ago when the Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, decided that space sector has to be opened up for the private sector. The reason he felt so is that as we look at the space economies throughout the world, we find that private sector plays a very important role in it. Whereas in India, the space sector has been more or less led by ISRO up to now. So therefore, several things were done. First was to establish a private sector unit called NSIL, PSU, as a commercial arm of DOS in March 2019. NSIL is the entity that does all the commercial launches, which of course uses ISRO's facilities, but does all the marketing, business development, and has already done several such launches, OneWeb being the last one that was done just a month ago, which got visibility all over the world. Then announced the creation of InSpace in June 2020. InSpace is the organization that I am chairing right now. That is to drive participation of private sector in space and also to authorize all the space activities in India. The third thing was to announce the Indian space policy in 2023, April 23, in fact it was announced just 10 days ago, and perhaps it was this meeting that perhaps prompted the government to speed it up and announce it before the meeting so that I can say that it's done. And I'm told that from tomorrow, the policy will be available for anybody to take a look at, to go through the detail. It's a very short policy, only about 8 or 9 pages, but covers almost everything that needs to be covered about how space sector will be managed in India. And I'll talk more about the Indian space policy. Next is the revision to FDI policy, which is right now in the works. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And I hope that in the next 2, 3, 4 months, we will have the FDI policy also announced. This is a replacement of the current FDI policy, which is quite restrictive. And then the space activity bill, which has to be approved by the parliament, will also be, is being worked upon, and hopefully it will be done, though it will be taking some time because a parliament bill takes quite a bit of time to go through all the processes. So the Indian space policy, as I said, that was announced 10 days ago, or approved 10 days ago. It's a very far-reaching policy. And in one sentence, it basically takes away all restrictions that India had on non-government entities to participate in the space sector. That means private sector in India can now build rockets and satellites, can launch, own, and operate space assets, can deliver commercial services, can co-own technologies with ISRO or on their own, can do Earth observation data acquisition and dissemination, can create infrastructure in ISRO premises or again on their own. Transfer of ISRO technologies to private sector is going to take quite a bit of priority now. Excuse me. Today I have a very bad throat. I didn't even think I'll be able to talk today. So ISRO's role is going to transition from what it has been doing in the past. It will be focusing on more on R&D, technology development, and scientific missions. Obviously, ISRO will be the facilitator of the private sector to play in this space because all the expertise, all the infrastructure, all the knowledge is with ISRO. InSpace will regulate, handhold, and promote the industry, create common use infrastructure, and NSIL will be the commercial arm of Department of Space. Next slide. The FDI policy will enable investment across the spectrum. Now, the current FDI policy is very restrictive. In the new policy, which will not yet announced, and therefore I cannot give you details, but basically it will open up satellite manufacturing operations, satellite data products and value addition, ground segment and user segment, launch vehicles and associated subsystems, and manufacturing of components and system subsystem for private sector in terms of FDI investment happening. So what this will do is facilitate two things. One is to allow the Indian startups to get investment from outside India, which today they are finding very difficult. And second is for companies outside India to come within India and set up their own operations because FDI policy will allow 100% ownership, subject to some approvals. And I should say that Honorable Prime Minister personally is driving the FDI policy, so he's very keen that we see this happen as quickly as possible. So in space, just to take 2 or 3 slides on what is in space supposed to be, it is a promoter, an enabler, an authorizer, and a supervisor. So these 4 words sometimes somewhat contradictory. Promoter and authorizer doesn't sometimes work together, but that's the role that we have. The authorizer role, of course, is to ensure that all space activities meet the requirements of safety, security, international laws, international treaties, and all that. The promoter role is where we handhold the private industry to help them to come into the space sector, working in most cases with ISRO, and also to help them to get some investments and so on. And of course, we do some enabling, do reviews, and help them to ensure that they do their launches properly. I won't go into the details of this slide. Also, it's very important, those of you who have dealt with many departments in Government of India, that if the private sector have to go door to door to many departments, it could be very challenging. Therefore, one of the roles that INSpace has to become the single window interface for the industry. And therefore, to coordinate between different departments, such as DOS, NSIL, Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, Department of Telecommunication, DPIIT, MEA, all that INSpace will do. INSpace will also help in technology transfer from ISRO to private sector, will also help in test support and technical consultancy, including setting up its own infrastructure for often used things that private sector can easily access. And capacity building also, again, working with ISRO in most cases. One of my colleagues is ready for a backup, so if I have to stop, Vinod, be ready. Where are you? Okay. So as we look at the Indian space sector, today India is about $8-9 billion space economy, and our aspiration is to be 5x in about 10 years. That means get to about 40-45 billion by that time. As you all know, that's easier said than done. There's a lot that has to be done to make it happen. For example, we have to do demand generation, demand aggregation within India and outside India for Indian technology and Indian infrastructure. We have to work on know-how in terms of transfer of technology, develop some new technologies, mentorship and implementation of for the private sector. We have to be very competitive globally. One cannot assume that India is necessarily the lowest cost, because everybody is competing today for the space market, and therefore everybody aggressively is pricing. One of the companies from US has become the most difficult one to deal with in terms of pricing. Everybody knows who I'm talking about. To set up quality standards and to enable funding for NGAs, which I'll show you is growing a little bit now. Competitive cost, as I said. And capacity, what we have today in ISRO is very, very good in terms of infrastructure, but that's good for today's overall space economy in India. If we have to go to $40-45 billion, we need a lot more than what we have. And that will also be done by ISRO and by private sector. And then manufacturing hubs is what we'll be creating with help of the space or state governments in India. The reason I put up this slide is that many of you, the 15 countries here, and as I heard in the morning session, that each of you is fully committed to space, and each of you believes that cooperation and alliances are a must in space. So as you look at this slide, you can probably identify that many of these bullets may apply to your country also, and many of these bullets may be something where you can play a role with respect to India. And therefore, it may be something that you can take back and think about and as to how this applies to you. So the private sector in India is gaining momentum after the announcement of opening up the private sector for space for private sector. Number of startups has gone to more than 150. Some big names or good known names, and many of them are outside, are Skyroot, Agnikul, Bellatrix, Pixel, and so on. The investment has also going up. Last year, India attracted $110 million of investment in the startup sector. Very small, but much bigger than what we had previous year. And there are many applications that are coming into space for various activities. And this is the famous sounding rocket launch that Honorable Minister had talked about in his video speech. This was done by Skyroot, went about 100 kilometers. So not a big deal in terms of how launches are, but a very big deal in terms of first time an Indian startup or Indian private sector has done this launch successfully. And growing private sector participation, again, names on the left I have already mentioned. The larger companies like Larsen & Toubro, Godrej, Nelco, Centum, OneWeb are all sort of going up the value chain. As Mr. Somnath mentioned earlier, that many of these companies were earlier doing only supplying parts and systems to ISRO, and now they're going up the value chain. And then PSUs such as BHEL, NHIL, HL are all in the space sector. Now, collaboration with G20 countries. India has started its space program way back with Apache with collaboration with 2 or 3 countries and has always had a lot of collaborations with different countries at the agency-to-agency level, with France, with US, with Russia, and almost all the countries. But I think that there is a lot more that can be done, and that's the essence of our dialogue that we will have today and that we will have in July. On how we can do more joint satellite missions, how we can develop payloads together, how we can do joint experiments, scientific experiments, how we can set up ground stations, share ground stations, how we can share data, how we can do disaster management throughout the globe, and capacity building and training. There, of course, there is a lot that can be done jointly. Emerging opportunities in the Indian space sector, we believe that these are the 3 or 4 sort of buckets in which we'll be working. Manufacturing of small satellites, space-grade components, and antennas, user terminals. And we are in dialogue with many companies outside India to be looking at setting up the manufacturing facilities here. We believe that India can become a hub for small launch vehicles. We already have 2 startups that are developing. ISRO has already done SSLV, and there are 2 more that will be developing these launch vehicles. So that could be an area where India could take a lead. Ground station services, right now India doesn't do too much for anyone outside India. That could be done in a bigger way. Satellite broadband and the EO data dissemination are other areas where India can play a key role. And then obviously the applications in all areas, marine, forest, urban planning, agriculture, what have you, where India, given its IT strength, can perhaps play a very major role. So advantage that India has, first of all, that there is a very clear support all the way from the Honorable Prime Minister of India. Institutional support in terms of policies already happened. The state space policies are also now being developed by individual states to see how the states can attract space investment. A strong technology partner in ISRO for the private sector, and a very good vendor ecosystem that almost any country can take advantage of. Growing manufacturing base, large domestic market, which is evolving, world-class software capabilities that we are all aware of, very high number of STEM graduates, and a low labor cost. So there are some of the advantages that India has, and when we mix up the direction that government is giving, we perhaps can work together with many of you in big ways. And there are some of the companies, large companies from outside India, that are currently active to looking at India for future. And finally, I think we can make the whole greater than the parts by having global partnerships, and all of you talked about that earlier. That's a must in space. Joint development, infrastructure development, private industry, trade bodies, all of these things, trade policies, agreements, how can we be aligned together and not go in diverse direction, investment funding, and sustainable space operation, which is very important and will be covered by one of the speakers after me. So with that, I think I'll conclude by saying that space forwards economic prosperity. We all understand, we realize, we appreciate, and if this G20 meeting can help us in aligning better, I think that will be the payback that we would get from all the effort that has been put in by all of you. Thank you very much. So if you have any questions for me, a couple of questions, then we can do that, or else we'll go to the next speaker. Yes. Yeah, Mexico, please.
Yeah, just a quick question. You said, I mean, one of the main aspects of the policy, of the new policy, is the no restriction for non-government entities, and at the same time you spoke that one of the attributes that in space will have is the regulation. Can you speak a little bit more about that? What kind of regulation you will have? What kind of authority you will have in terms of regulation? Thank you.
Shall I answer?
Yeah.
Sure. I will answer on his behalf. The regulation is compliance to international requirements. For example, you need to have frequency coordination, you need to have the orbital space coordination, you need to have liability conventions met as far as the orbital objects are concerned or launches are concerned. And also the domestic rules governing the safety and security of the people. So these are the regulations. But the operations part, it is open.
Yes, please.
Side for startups, you were talking about startups. Is there a venture capital or a financing ecosystem that you are working on through your institution?
Short answer is yes. As I showed you earlier, that last year we got significant amount of increase in interest of startups and interest of venture capitalists. As you can imagine, that venture capitalists obviously have to see that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and they are kind of waiting to see outcome of some of these work that's happening. And as we see more and more success of the startups, I have no doubt that more of the VCs and even PEs will come up. We get a lot of queries right now about interest in a startup investment, but most of the startups right now are very early stage, and they are probably not even reached the venture capital threshold. They are more of angel investor threshold, but I think it will happen. That's my belief. We'll have to do a lot of work. In space will play a key role in that, and we are talking to a lot of funding agencies. Okay, so we will now move to the next presentation, that is by Mr. Moeller. I should say that with the FDI policy also will help in that, because right now, because of the FDI policy, many of the outside investors are not able to invest in India.
Good afternoon, a pleasure to be here. Thank you for receiving the European Space Policy Institute. I will maybe start from the end very quickly. Maybe first, we probably are a facilitator. You described what you are, and we try to help dialogue and facilitate. And this is one of the activities we do here today. And I like the word alliance, so I'll also say a few words on how this could take shape. Maybe also starting from the end, 3 messages I would like you to retain. This is more than just the space parameter. It has been said many times also when it comes to economic impact. I think we have an impact that can be much further than what we discuss normally. Space is transformative. I would dare to compare it to internet, and the moment in time where we are today is maybe the internet moment of space. It's a new age. And last but not least, return on investment and investment that is maybe more short-sighted to be balanced against what is societal and wider economic impact and benefit, and also diplomatic value and considerations of autonomy. So this is really what I would like you to retain at the end of a quick walkthrough. There's quite a bit of data, and I do not expect you to retain that data. Maybe on this one, on the left-hand side, you see parameter on what we look at when we say what is the economy and what is what are we measuring. And mostly you'll talk about more direct impact. This is about revenues of industries, it's taxpayers' revenue, it's people employed. There are a few attributes that are typically associated to this. And there is something wider, which is called a catalytic, and I'll come to this in a moment. On the right-hand side, really, the numbers you need to retain is more the overall size of the public invest. The numbers on the slide are not the latest, and we today are talking about probably 100 billion globally, and about 10 to 15 billion, depending how you measure, on private invest on top. Those are significant numbers, and it's a factor to keep in mind, 10 to 1 roughly between public and private. There's a lot of talk on public, a lot of talk on private, but public is a key enabler. NASA was mentioned, and a lot of what is happening in the US today is a result of decisions taken 20 years ago when a whole ecosystem was put in motion, and I think we should be aware of this. Secondly, if you look into what are the segments, we talked about upstream and downstream. I think it's common knowledge, and it has been said a lot, the money is happening in the downstream, the impact is in the downstream. Many examples were mentioned throughout the day. Also things that are not so directly in the economy, if you like, but food security, water supply, global health, agriculture, pharmaceutical, security, defense, smart cities, and also villages were mentioned, transport and disaster management, examples that are relevant. If you look at Europe in this, and we are providing here a bit of a European perspective on these numbers, it's about 15% of that market today. If we go one step further and we stay in the same parameters, so we're still concerned with more direct impact, and you subdivided this now into upstream and downstream, and you look into how much the economy represents in terms of manufacturing, of space infrastructures, of launchers and the likes, and which of the downstream segments in terms of navigation, telecommunications, Earth observation constitute the market. You have a breakdown here, and I'd like to highlight two things. First of all, launcher is below 20% of the upstream. Upstream is only 10% of the total. So launchers, in terms of economic terms, is very small. Still, there's a lot of emphasis today on launchers, and that is justified. They are a key enabling element. If you want to have autonomous capability for anything you do, you need the launchers. But in terms of economic parameter, they are just, it's probably doing injustice to the sector, but they are just an enabler of something much, much bigger. So I would recommend not to only focus on this, although this is a lot in the press, and we may see another launch today that may change the course of the space business to come. Same on the downstream. Earth observation is 1%. It is 1%. It is a key enabler for many things we discussed. In agriculture, in climate change, it has a societal role. It is essential. It is strategic. It is an emerging market. It is a quickly developing market, but it is small. It is 1% of the total. And if you look into what are the big investments today in the downstream, they are in connectivity. What you see today on Starlink and others, OneWeb was mentioned. This is where the immediate return on invest is, the ROI, compared to what maybe is more societal and economic benefit on the longer term, and with implications in terms of maybe also diplomacy tools and autonomy requirements. Now, I'm happy that we used the same number that the UK mentioned, and we did not coordinate. This is a zoom, it's an example case. The UK, again, I'm talking about from a European perspective, I would argue is with the most commercially driven actors in space in Europe. We heard from France, also France is very active with 300 million private investors, considerable numbers. So 17.5 billion is what was an assessment recently, health and size of the UK space industry. And again, you see a number of parameters, how you could this measure further. One is the productivity factor of 2.5. This is an industry where invest can have a high payback, and this is illustrated here. But the point I'm trying to make here is, if you jump, and this slide in fact did it, and the UK is with a few who did that assessment, and it's not such a hard science, I have to say, as a policy institute or a researcher. If you jump from the direct, which is more measurable, to the catalytic, to the wider, it is not so easy, and it's a whole science that still may need to be developed further, but you see the number changes by a factor of 20. If you unplug space from your economies and societies, this is a number that is maybe not a monetary number as such, but it is a key number that tells you how dependent we have become and increasingly will be. The same if you unplug your phones. I don't know what would happen today if you would not have your phone and be connected to the home base. We will have similar dependencies in the future, and this is one of the key messages I want you to take home. This link is important. It is not just about space. Space is hundreds of billions, it will be a trillion, it has been mentioned, but it creates dependency, it is transversal, it is really changing the decades to come. It is part of the future fabric. Now, this is an example of what recently has been published in Europe. I would invite you to have a look at this, an interesting report. It's called Revolution Space, and it's triggered by a high-level group of representatives from outside the space sector, including the former Secretary General of NATO, former ministers of governments, and other high personalities. And they looked at space exploration as a question, should Europe engage into human spaceflight, some autonomy in going to moon and beyond? And they came to the conclusion that yes, Europe should, but the reason is it's not just about space exploration. It is not about just going to the moon. It is part of animating and taking a next step on a whole space ecosystem, and with this, the whole catalytic effect that I illustrated before on the case of the UK, and here the case is made for Europe as a whole. There is an ambition for Europe to capture 1/3 of the 1 trillion future market through taking new momentum in Europe, and I think the UK said it was 10% for the UK, so I think the level of ambition is comparable, and that is good. Now, taking a bit of a different perspective quickly, this is an attempt to look into what are drivers that condition us when we go to space, and there has been a lot of emphasis on the economic dimension, and this is also the focus of today's meeting, but obviously there is a political and security dimension, and we are at a time where maybe you need to get these two elements, or I should say 3 elements, or 2 gravitational fields in that case, in best synergy. So I start with the blue one, and you see if you are economically driven, this is really not putting the priority on the policy domain. It's maybe less regulated, it's more open market forces. Security dimension may be still there, but maybe not that prominent. As soon as you have a strong requirement on policy, on control, on authorization, on security, on geopolitics, the formula gets more complex. And you need to find that balance. I cannot give you the answer where this balance is, but you should be aware that you cannot engage in the blue without giving the appropriate consideration to the red triangle. If you break this down a bit more into detail, you can have an aspect of capacity and autonomy. Capacity can be something, you just have the tool to do it. This is a phone, most of this is probably not European, I use it. But I have a dependency. I do not control the supply of what is in here. And maybe the operator is not, in that case, I'm in a roaming, it will not be a European operator. But I have a capacity, I can do things with this. It's a different story if I want this as my autonomous tool, and the same is true for space. So it is not only a capability question, it is also a matter of whether I have the supply chain at hand. It is also a matter whether I can use the tools to my political requirements. So this is really a careful balance, again, between something that is maybe more blue and commercial and something that has other concerns. And I do not expect you to read this, but this is a breakdown how we indicate, it's indicators for capacity, and you will see on the left-hand side what is called here hard capacity. Those, the typical things we discussed before, it's Earth observation, remote sensing, it's navigation, it is science, it is exploration, it is transportation, all the assets that space can give you to do something with it. What is maybe more interesting is on the right-hand side, and this is the beyond space. This is the whole sector of agriculture. The examples we had before, and I repeat, food security or water, health, pharmaceutical, transport, disaster management was just mentioned by my previous speaker. Those are elements where it's a matter of where do you go in the fabric of your economy and society. This is where you need to succeed. It's not the supply chain in itself, it is really the coupling of what you can do technically and where it serves a purpose. And on the bottom of this, you will find also the security and defense dimension. And again, this is going back to remarks I made on the autonomy. So here, this is a contrasting of these. It is probably also relevant in these days where maybe we will have more of a multipolar world in the future with several actors, and certain autonomy requirements may be relevant. I complete this part of the presentation just with a space power map. This is something we do at SP, and this is a live map. This is a snapshot of today. And if you apply the criteria I presented before, you will see that in terms of true space powers, you have the US, China, and Russia. And Europe, for instance, is not considered here as a space power. It has a high degree of capacity, but a lesser degree of autonomy. India here is measured with a higher degree of autonomy, but maybe with capacity to be developed, and we understood from the previous speaker, there's a high ambition to move up to in the blue field. Now, with this, I would conclude on the part on the economic consideration and the context. Just a few words to conclude, and a European perspective on how to cooperate or work in an alliance. There is certainly an element, and this is now reflecting what we have in Europe, there is a government-to-government notion here. We can talk a lot about the private sector, but there is a lot in particular in Europe about how do the different actors, national agencies, European Space Agency, EU institutions, how do they work between each other? There's not one single entity. Then secondly, the public-private dimension, space industry, including new space. So it's the established actors. In Europe, there are well-established actors, there are new actors. Important, number three, space to non-space. And again, it's within relevant ministries that hold the portfolios for transport, energy, or health, and others, but also the industry champions in these domains. And I underlined it here, obviously, the dimension Europe working in a global partnership with other space actors in different sectors and strategies. And strategies here would include, for instance, digital security and other. Now, come back to the word facilitator I used in the introduction. So we would consider ourselves as a facilitator not only in European dialogue, but increasingly so in global dialogue. We are, in fact, engaging internationally in an increased level, and our presence here today is testimony of this. What is quoted here is pretty much taken from our statutes. This is what we are defined with our stakeholders. So to promote the European space policy in a global level in an active forum, this is a forum. We do analysis, there is work behind, a lot of thinking in the teams, and then also identify and make recommendations on way forward. And before closing, maybe a quick word so you know who we are. We are founded by the European Space Agency and the Austrian agency, and we count between our members all the major national space agency, including the German agency DLR, the CNES from France, ASI from Italy, the UK Space Agency, and other agencies. And we also have members from industry. I want to highlight maybe Eutelsat, partner in merger with OneWeb as an example. A typical case where, for instance, we also did analysis on the economic implications. You see a map of Europe here, our footprint today, and this is growing as we speak. This gives you an example of what we are involved in right now. It is quite wide-ranging. This is where we stand in dialogue within Europe, but also you can see in Africa, Asian Pacific, the US, the Emirates, Japan, India today, and the G20. So this is the framework in which we work. And this is, and I think it's the last slide, and I come to an end. Those are the domains. This is the structure we have defined. And you'll see it is the green and climate part towards net zero, it is security and defense, it is the industry and finance part, which is maybe closer to the focus of today. It's the scientific and exploration part. Reference was made many times to importance how to engage and inspire the future generations. I think this is a key element we really have to have close to our hearts. And last but not least, the layer that you need to do anything of it. You need the orbits, you need the frequencies, you need the launchers, and this is the key enabling element. And with this, I would conclude and thank you. And this is Odyssey in Space, and I think a few days ago, it's 55 years that this was on the cinema screens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Moeller. Any questions for him, or one or two questions? Netherlands?
The fascinating presentation. I would just like to relate your presentation also to the forum that we're in today, and I was wondering if you have got a European space policy perspective, but also have a very global perspective in your presentation. If you could advise us as a track on space economy, what we could work on and what kind of ambitions we could have, what would you say if you are relating your perspective to this forum specifically?
I take one by one, yes. That is a very wide question. I will give you a simplified answer. There are two parts of space. One is the institutional established one, where the governmental part pays, owns, controls, and this is the good old times. And then there is the new one where people don't want to be regulated. When they put money, they want a return immediately. And it's giving a lot of the dynamics. It's part of what makes the difference today. So I think the most simple answer I could give you, we need to find jointly ways to get these two actors together. And we have seen examples how India is addressing this. I think there are different recipes in different world regions. Depends also at what point in time you did it. The US are 20 years ahead because they opened up the market to the private forces. And probably today the formula is a bit different. One thing I would wish we managed to do is together to connect space to all these sectors that are beneficial, that can benefit from space, to an extent that you also have industry champions. And I know that our host has been working in the automotive industry. Automotive is a champion. Automotive is connected mobility, autonomous driving. And you need space for this. And Mr. Musk has understood it. He's producing cars and rockets and satellites. And I can tell you he will make use of the combination of these. And this is just one example. So public and private together and linking in to the sectors in ministries and champion industries.
Thank you. Any one more question? Anyone? Yes, please.
What are your thoughts on having regulators in the space sector? Would they be enabling or restrictive to the private players?
I could not fully understand the beginning of the question. Could you repeat? Sorry.
What are your thoughts on having regulators in the space sector? Would they be enabling or restrictive to the private players? I come from the India experience, so we have a new body called InSpace. So it's from that perspective I'd like to understand your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think we are all exposed to an enormous speed of putting things in orbit and starting to create revenues from space systems that is much quicker than any regulator today. And I think as much as there should be a branch where obviously the regulator has to follow and has to regulate, you have to put some rules to the game for sure. It typically takes some time. I think what needs to be encouraged is that the industry actors themselves find a platform to come together. They also have an interest to make sure that they do not pollute the orbits they need to make their business. And they need a platform for that exchange, and I think we all should work on the two axes. So one is more the governmental regulatory law approach, and the other is really to have a platform where best practices are implemented.
Thank you. May I now request Mr. Jan Christensen to come and give his speech?
Good afternoon, distinguished delegates. It is an honor to be here, and thank you to our hosts within the Department of Space and within the state government here for providing such an excellent forum and venue. So good afternoon, my name is Ian Christensen. I'm the Director of Private Sector Programs for the Secure World Foundation. And I'm here to speak today on the responsibility theme. So reflecting on the remarks so far, I think Mr. Mueller gave us a very apt introduction here. Space is still very much a government-driven market. We're seeing private economy emerge, we're seeing private investment emerge, and I think as I go into my remarks, what I'd like you all to think about is what does that transition mean as we move from a government-driven domain to a domain in which we have a much increased private sector character and a much more multi-stakeholder, multi-user domain. That's going to require multi-stakeholder processes to navigate and to manage. And so that's what I want to kind of think about. And so in that regard, I do want to commend the organizers for the thematic framework that they've given us of economy, responsibility, and alliance, because I do think that does provide the very appropriate lens to that multi-stakeholder process that we need. So Secure World Foundation is a private, nonprofit organization based out of the United States, headquarters in Denver, Colorado, and office in Washington, D.C. as well. We focus on cooperative dialogues around space sustainability. What is space sustainability? To us, space sustainability is the approach and thinking that we need to continue to operate in and benefit from a stable orbital environment as a community, as a global community. So all of the direct and indirect applications and benefits of space that we were talking about earlier today, that depends upon the environment in which those systems are operating. It depends on that environment being stable, being safe, being secure. So that is where we come from. Most of our work focuses in 3 or 4 areas. Dialogues around space policy. So for example, we participate in a number of multilateral bodies at the UN level, the Group on Earth Observation on space policy. We have a set of activities around national security space, essentially providing transparency and confidence building measures around how governments use space in the national security domain. We have a set of activities around human environmental security, looking at data and access to space applications for the benefit of society. And then my area focuses on commercial space and some of the best practices and some of the way that regulation needs to be updated and evolved. So as an example of our work, we work in 2 modes. We provide dialogues, which I'm going to discuss as we go forward. We also provide resources and research. And so we have published what we refer to as the Handbook for New Actors in Space. It's available in English, Spanish, Chinese, and French. Covers basically the existing knowledge base we have about how to operate sustainably in orbit, starting with the International Framework for Space Activities, covering national space policy, and then looking at operational best practices in the industry domain. So that is freely available up on the SWF website, and it's also available on Amazon for those of you who want to donate to the Jeff Bezos Fund. So I'm going to start with the space environment itself. Space is a naturally hazardous environment. Things like space weather, things like naturally occurring micrometeorite debris, things like simply the harsh temperature environment we have to operate. So it's difficult to begin with. But into that environment, we're putting human-induced additional risk. And a key example of that is space debris. So there's roughly, according to the European Space Agency, about 36,000 pieces of space debris in low Earth orbit that are greater than 10 centimeters in diameter, and about 1 million pieces estimated that are between 1 centimeter and 10 centimeters in diameter. Any of these objects, if they were to hit an operational satellite, could cause that satellite to be non-functional and to create additional debris. So a big challenge that we face is how to mitigate the creation of additional debris and how to remediate the debris that we have in orbit today. 2 different angles, 2 different threads there. Mitigation, mitigation is about how we design and how we operate new systems. Remediation is about how we deal with legacy objects. Many of those are government, some of them are commercial. There's an emerging international norm to not intentionally create additional debris. So as already mentioned today, we've seen a number of the G20 nations, 9 of them in fact, sign up to voluntary commitments to not conduct direct ascent missile ASAT tests. In industry, we're seeing commitments to remove satellites at the end of their life earlier than what the initial or what the accepted standard is. So the accepted global standard is space missions should be removed from orbit within 25 years of end of mission. Industry is moving to a 5-year period, and we're seeing that reflected in regulation as well. I think I advanced. Yep. All right. So what we're seeing now is the emergence of the private sector. So a lot of the objects, a lot of the activity is driven by industry. The chart here on the right, again, comes from the European Space Agency. It shows two things. It shows, if you look at the far right side, this very steep, almost exponential increase in the number of payloads launched into orbit. In the last 5-10 years, that number has increased dramatically, and you see that it is entirely driven by the private sector. So the other thing the chart shows is in the colors, the sector of operator, amateur, civil, defense, and commercial. And what you see is, for the beginning of the space age through the mid-2000s, it was a mostly governmental-driven domain. Looking at the last decade, it is clearly a commercial-driven domain. So space is changing into this multi-user environment. There are currently about 8,000 satellites on orbit, just under that. Roughly half of those are operated by a single commercial operator. SpaceX has been mentioned already today. But most of the key governance principles that we have were developed in that earlier era, where it was a governmental-driven domain. So we're challenged to think about how to update those principles and apply them to a domain that is commercial in character. Commercial in character meaning emergence of novel applications and services driven by industry. So as the private sector becomes more prevalent, the pace of activity and the introduction of new services, such as large constellations for broadband internet, such as satellite servicing, the idea you can update, repair, maintain satellites on orbit, such as private human spaceflight activities, and even activities, commercial activities in the lunar and cislunar environment. As these activities develop, they challenge the pace, the efficacy, and the appropriateness of existing regulation. And in some areas, we need to develop, to the question that was just asked, we need to develop new regulation. Industry needs that certainty, and governments need to follow through on international responsibility. So this is areas like commercial lunar activity, satellite servicing. Other areas, such as deployment of large constellations, really don't fit the existing regulation we have for those sectors. So we need to update regulation, update international coordination to take account of these new factors. Governments, as we've already heard today, are also developing economic policy to incentivize and encourage commercial space activities, which is excellent, provides benefit, but it also provides for the opportunity for more competition. And so it's forums like this where discussion of coordination and shared principles can inform that competition and allow competition to occur in a way that brings innovation. Some of these new activities are causing quite visible impacts on the space domain, which raises the public visibility and concern over space sustainability and space congestion. So the image on the left is a shot taken from an optical telescope observing astronomy, and you see the streaks across that. That is caused by, over time, the orbital paths of these large satellite constellations reflecting back on the observations and actually obscuring and impacting the ability to conduct clean astronomy. So this is a very visible, tangible impact and has raised some public concern about what large constellations mean and how we should oversee them. So large constellations, these are OneWeb, SpaceX, or Starlink. There's a system being planned in Europe known as IRIS. There's a system being planned in China known as the GW constellation. So very large constellations numbering in the thousands to even tens of thousands of satellites. This is an approach to space that is new. It is different. It's designed to provide increased connectivity, increased broadband access, and provide telecommunication services to a much more global and easily accessible set of users, which is great, provides a lot of benefit. However, we don't really have the regulatory processes to oversee the safe coordination, safe operation, and safe practices to maintain the stability of the orbital environment. We have even questions and discussion of whether low Earth orbit has a physical, tangible capacity. So We've talked about spectrum today. We've talked about orbital slots. We manage certain aspects of the space environment as a resource. Low Earth orbit, in terms of its physical assets and physical management, we don't yet manage the physical capacity of low Earth orbit as a resource, and that is something that there's a fair amount of research underway to do and a fair amount of discussion, and maybe an area where more coordination amongst nations in this room is possible. There's also other things that we can do. So as these large constellations are deployed, we can encourage inter-operator coordination. We can encourage operators to publicize the positional information on their satellites, to publish maneuver plans, and we can encourage companies and countries to register with the existing space situational awareness and space tracking systems that we have operated by several countries in order to participate in the global space safety kind of notification system that we have in absence of a more formal space traffic management regime that was mentioned in an earlier statement. Secure World Foundation, sometimes in partnership with SB, has been holding a series of dialogues amongst regulators to discuss this challenge of large constellations. This has led to some key themes. So a recognition that we're going to require a significant amount of political will to implement these changes, recognition that the large constellations will likely be overseen most effectively at national level, and that there's value in having interchange and coordination discussions, and consideration of tools such as market access policies that may provide a common method for addressing these constellations. There's also a recognition that equity considerations in terms of future orbital access is an important discussion within this theme. So I want to briefly kind of switch to the investment theme. So Mr. Mueller mentioned that companies have an incentive to operate sustainably. The business plans of these constellations, the business plans of some of the commercial lunar missions, some of the private space stations, they depend upon the orbital environment being safe to operate in order to provide those services. So there's a natural incentive for companies to act responsibly. That's amplified by the private capital that is coming into the space sector. So this is data from a US market firm known as Bryce Tech, where they track global space startup investments. And we see that there's significant capital flowing into the space sector. The US is the leading domain for that, or leading country for that capital, but there's significant capital coming in China, there's significant capital coming in Europe, and we heard a little bit about the role of India coming in today. So investors need to see return on this money, companies need to see business plans close, and that provides the incentive for companies to think about their own way in which they act responsibly. So a key trend that we're seeing in industry right now is the development of voluntary industry commitments for space sustainability or for responsible space operations. On the left side of the chart is 3 groups that are doing this: Space Safety Coalition, Confers, and Coalition of OneWeb, SpaceX, and Iridium. These are groups of satellite operators, groups of spacecraft operators that have voluntarily come together and produced recommended practices and principles for safe operations in orbit. So some key elements that come out of these: encouragement of transparency and communication of intention in operations, sharing that positional data I talked about, exchanging information and contact points to avoid collisions, commitment to post-mission disposal within 5 years, and encouragement of responsible design practices, as well as initial proposals for rules of the road. There's a clear role here for government to coordinate with and support these standards and best practices as they're developed by industry, and regulation can be a tool to ensure follow-through in these commitments. So it's great to see industry make voluntary commitments. We do want to see those implemented, and as they're implemented, regulation can be a tool there. At the international level, we also have a multilateral discussion of responsible practices. So the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space has agreed to 21 sustainability guidelines covering policy and regulatory frameworks, covering safety, covering international cooperation, covering research and development. There's a current discussion going on about the next round of these guidelines. Implementation of the guidelines can support, reference, and tie into those industry standards that I talked about, and it can also provide the commonality across different jurisdictions as we compete for economic growth. So in conclusion, space environment is becoming much more complex. That's driven by private sector, new actors, new applications. It's also driven by competition for economic benefit and for innovation. That competition, that commercial activity offers the potential for tremendous benefit. Regulation and governance is challenged by the pace of that innovation. Consensus can be difficult at the international level, but we do foresee a lot of benefit in some of these discussions in the international forums around LTS in particular. However, implementation is probably most effective at the national level, and the private sector and the multi-stakeholder process must play a role there. So how do we maintain coordination? Leadership commitments, regulator-to-regulator dialogues, following through on industry best practice, and supporting operator coordination to the extent that we can. And so that, I believe, is my 15 minutes, so thank you.
Any questions for Ian? Anyone has a question? No, I believe
No
you were
questions,
very clear.
uh-oh.
No.
All right, well, I'm happy to talk to anyone in the tea break this afternoon, so thank you.
Thank you. May now request Capital Vishal to come in, please.
So I'm the fourth speaker, so I'll kind of say that what I'm going to cover today is directly our suggestions on what and how we can cooperate, looking at the new space economy and what opportunities we have. And I think when we say new space economy, collaboration is central to it. In effect, I would call it a center of gravity of how we can grow in space as we go forward. My talk, I'll quickly go through G20 and impact of space sector. India's space ecosystem, which has been covered very well. I'll show what India can offer globally. What are the areas of collaboration, suggestive areas with illustrations. If you come to the global perspective on G20, we are in a global common when you talk of space economy. If you look at G20 countries, I think with 68% of the global human resource and almost 80% of contribution to GDP, I don't think any other collaboration can have the impact on space which G20 can have. And with the impact which I'm going to talk to you about across various sectors is very central to see how the G20 countries can think of collaboration in various areas. There are four major drivers, I would say, for collaboration. The first is, how do you look at nation building? And when we say nation building, it is across digitalization. Most of you would know every digital platform in every country around the globe is driven by an atomic clock. So how space plays a very important role in digitization. Space-enabled data for businesses to grow. And finally, both business and strategic initiatives which contribute to nation building. Economic growth, we've heard speakers talk about it. I just want to mention that looking at about $1 trillion economy, which we're looking at about in 2047, the multiplier effect on space, investment in space is close to 1.4 to 2.2 on GDP. And if you look at in the employment, on an average it is 1.2 to 2.4. And towards the transactional investments which are made, you have returns in terms of tax revenue upwards of 35%. So there is a huge economic impact. Now, how does it get facilitated is by creating innovation catalysts, which also has a multiplier effect in other sectors, whatever happens in space. Democratization of technology, democratization of governance, of funding, all of these factors also play a very important role in looking at space in nation building. Coming to India's ecosystem, I mean, we have spoken about it a lot. I would just focus on the sectors which are impacted by it. We have bucketed these into 9 broad sectors. But if you look at it from agriculture to disaster management, insurance and finance is something which is greatly impacted by Earth observation, transport, which includes rail, road, aviation, maritime, infrastructure, consumer solutions, and I think consumer solutions, which is complete, as Muller also spoke, largely impacted by SATCOM, energy, mining, climate services, health, education. Now, I have clubbed about 16 sectors here, and these are the sectors, as per our estimate, which have the largest impact for the common human mankind. Specifically coming to India, we estimate that India has a potential to look at about 8% of the global market. We are currently around 2% by 2033, which is about $45 billion. And we see an impact about 1.4 to 2.2. The largest impact would come in the downstream, as some speakers have spoken about, whether it is Earth observation, navigation, or communication, which has the strongest impact. Another takeaway from this slide is, if you see, almost 38% of growth is there in the exports, and we're looking at about 22% export, which will add to the Indian market by 2033. Hence, this would come from collaboration, by having access to markets and how we collaborate. And I think G20 is the ideal platform to look at this. I won't go much into this. This has been spoken by Dr. Goenka as well. Under the new space, India is looking at creating an ecosystem which is driven by a whole-of-nation approach, where the space agency is looking at R&D, deep space exploration, technology and space asset development, with a distributed governance. What we are also looking at is creating a space marketplace in India for the buyers and sellers of space economy to come together. And this is one area which also, I suggest, which we could think of extending to the G20 nations, of how do you clear a community of buyers and sellers on a same marketplace across G20 and also beyond G20 for the benefit of the mankind. Broadly, we see the offerings which India has can be clubbed into two areas: the Indian Ocean region, which looks at Middle East, East Africa, South Asia, the countries here, most of Southeast Asia, and these are the areas which are covered by the Indian space assets right now, where we can look at downstream offering, bases our IT capabilities, we can look at satellite as a service, launch as a service, and globally, India can contribute in being a hub for satellite manufacturing and launch vehicles, other than the SAS and launch as a service, and also how can we collaborate for potential space exploration and space resource utilization. Having seen what we could offer, now I would dive straight into some areas, suggestive areas, where I think we can collaborate as a community of G20 nations and also beyond G20. What is important, I want to first point to make, is that space should be seen as a critical infrastructure. Satellites in orbit are infrastructure. If governments can spend money on infrastructure, creating assets in space is also enabling infrastructure for the benefit of both businesses and citizens. The 6 key pillars which we think we can cooperate is co-development, co-production. I will talk a bit about some illustrative examples. Sharing of resources, infrastructure, talent development, joint funding, technology, R&D, and I think the most important part is Earth observation, navigation, and communication, which impacts the space to Earth or the common citizen. And lastly, how can we share data across various areas to benefit, bring in space as a global common. Coming to the first part, looking at co-development and co-production, I think this is an area where we can collaborate into looking at creating space manufacturing ecosystems. And how some of the areas could be satellite launch vehicles. We could look at framework for space data management, solution applications in the downstream. We could look at software solution for future constellations, co-production in spacecraft, avionics, components, space. These are some of the illustrative areas which we could look at in co-production, co-development. We could also look at sharing of resource in infra. Space is a sector which involves technology. These are the challenges, high investments, sharing of testing labs, infrastructure, creating global centers of excellence, shared ground segment, the ground part, which is the downstream, which is very, I would say, central to realizing the benefits to a common man, and sharing of space assets in terms of satellites in the air. The other two important parts are talent development and joint funding. And talent development is something which is happening today, as we know, between government and space agencies. But how can we take it to the industry? How can we take it to the private sector? How do academic institution and technical institution collaborate in terms of talent exchange, etc.? Funding is a huge issue. How can we again look at private sector? And so here we have a suggestion that maybe creation of a framework within G20 for startups globally that align with our goals which we assign through either accelerator programs or funding coming in for areas could be one way of looking at a focus area. Coming to R&D, global space economy in future will go through will need technology transfer from space agencies to private industry and also R&D in future space technologies. I would just, these are some illustrative areas. I would just say that creating a platform for private sector for collaboration and technology development amongst the G20 countries is the need of the hour. There are platforms being created between space agencies and governments, but how do we involve the private sector, which is going to drive the space economy in new space tomorrow? Then I think this is the area which I want to say, especially if you're looking at the domains, Earth observation, navigation, and communication synergies in G20 are something that we need to give the main focus, because this is where we create application services for the common man. In terms of interoperability, data sharing, I would suggest that we should do a socio-economic benefit. Moeller has spoken about it, and as well, and how G20 countries in the next 10 years can impact globally in various sectors. I'll talk about the sectors in the next slide. And I think the last point I want to make is access to market. I think it is very essential that G20 countries come together and G20 plus countries come, and we provide access to each other for civil applications, for socio-economic benefits that we see so obvious. Lastly, I would say that building synergies across Earth observation, navigation, and communication creates strong socio-economic benefits. And we have tried to map it on a heat map. What are the benefits across various sectors in EO, nav, and communication in medium, high, and very high? We have quantifiable data, but it's just a heat map. What can be easily seen: transport, agriculture, allied sectors, insurance, consumer solutions, disaster management are areas which we have challenges in our respective countries and also beyond the G20 countries. So it's a strong case for us to see how we look at from the sectoral perspective. And I think Moeller spoke a very good point. How do we have industrial champions for each sector? And then bring in the aspect of what do we need to collaborate. The last point I would say, direct and indirect impact on almost 12 out of 70 sustainable development goals which are impacted by space sector, and that's a huge number. And if we are looking at SDG goals today, I think we should think of collaboration in space, and some of the points which I mentioned, see how we can take it forward. And these are some suggestions from us as we currently are engaged in creating a decadal vision and strategy for us. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Any questions for Captain Musal? Anyone? Everyone is very slow in asking questions.
I think we have to.
Okay, thank you. So that completes the four presentations that we had. We have about 15 minutes for discussion. You will agree that in the three presentations made by experts, we have covered the three themes: economy, responsibility, and alliance. And the idea of a 15-minute discussion now is to kind of get your views on what your takeaway is from this and how some of this may shape our agenda in the July meeting. But before I open up for all of you to come in, I'm going to request Dr. Somnath to give his sort of takeaway from what he has heard today or add anything to it.
Thank you, Dr. Goenka. So, morning till now, we have been hearing various speeches from the members, invitees, and also our study teams who made a good presentation. So I will first list a few items that are very important for us and a summary of what we take out of this discussion. So the first and foremost is that space technology or space activity is something that is very important for the overall economy of nations. I think this understanding has now come and is no longer an exhibition of the might or otherwise. So it has real role to play, and it can create jobs. It can also drive innovations and technological growth in the nation. And next point is that I understand the scale of this activity is going to grow primarily on account of various factors that has come in. One is the access to space has become really much better now, and everybody is actually predicting, all those study teams are predicting that the scale of growth of the space sector is really going to be phenomenal in the coming years. The third point is that we understand that out of all three segments, the upstream, downstream, and the top level, the applications are the key, and unless we develop applications of sufficient quantity, of sufficient magnitude, the rest of the sector is not going to grow, and the operational economic activity is really going to be in the application domain. So, and this again coming primarily out of the access to technology and access to data is really increasing world over. We also realize that another important issue of sustainability is very important, and many speakers talked about it, like issues related to debris, the studies, the space technology itself giving a lot of understanding on the climate change and weather. So we need to address sustainability as an important topic while we deal with the space economy. We also have to understand that we need to create new markets for space sector to grow, and unless we create markets, none of these predictions are going to hold good. There are many markets in terms of the data, in terms of the new emerging technologies like IoT, the business, and also services. I think all of these are really going to feed into the creation of new markets. We should also, as a community of nations, we must also look at how we can increase data sharing and operation sharing. I think this is very, very important. For this, we need to look at various aspects like the academic interactions, technology sharing without creating so much restrictions, and also sharing of the capacity across various nations. And for all of this to happen, it can no longer be, the space can no longer be in the context of the governments and space agencies. It has to be only with the support of the private space actors, and we need to promote and support this across all of the G20 nations. I think this is what I understood out of all of these discussions. I leave it to you for the rest of the discussions.
Thank you, very good summary. Now, your views, please. Any takeaways, anything that you would like to add to it, any proposals for July discussion, anything? Yes, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I just have a question of the panel, and especially the presentation on debris, space debris. From the charts that were put up, it really seems like, the exponential growth in the number of satellites in space is really a phenomenon of the last 5 years or so. Can I just ask about the risk of collision? Are there detailed studies being done that quantify how the risk of collision is growing, just on a probability basis? Because from seeing that sort of hockey stick kind of acceleration, is our risk of collision growing at the same amount?
Yes, the answer is yes. The risk of collision is a probabilistic number that in a vast space of that around Earth, some object meeting another object is still a probability, which is very, very low. So that's why we are able to do space missions even now with almost a few lakhs of items still there. But then it's no longer going to be the case if you don't regulate from now on. For example, if a space object hit another object, it creates again thousands of debris, and there can be a chain reaction that can happen. So what we need to prevent today is a potential collision possibility has to be avoided at all cost. And also that we need to regulate where we are putting things. For example, there are zones where human space flights are likely to be. We need to regulate that everybody won't put satellites there. And we should also create rules and regulations by which we dispose of objects which are non-functional. So this is something that we need to work on as a global community. And there are discussions happening, dialogues happening, but there are no strong regulations today enforcing it. It's mostly voluntary with respect to various space agency. And from the voluntary way of operation, I think it has to grow to a regulatory way of operation by understanding between nations have to grow. That's the only thing, but the potential of this happening is very, very high, and it can happen all on a sudden. So we don't think that the danger of debris is not just a very progressive one, but the moment a collision takes place, it will create chain reactions, and it will cannot be taken back for next hundreds of years. It cannot be solved for next hundreds of years because their future launches will become impossible in such a case. Thank you.
Yeah, the debris issue is like climate change. It doesn't matter who has caused it, everybody pays the price for it. And I think this is one of the biggest concern going forward as space activity is growing. And I think R&D on debris removal, practical possibility of debris removal is something that's very important. I hope one of these days, one of the countries or agencies will come up with some very effective ways of debris removal. Thank you. Any other inputs, any thoughts? Yes, please.
Yes, I wanted to, two things. One of them is that if it's possible to share the presentations that we received, that were given today with us, that would be very useful. But the second thing is a question that I have, and I'm not an expert on these issues. The question of cooperation amongst, to deal with all of these issues. It's certainly true that, I mean, what we're focusing here is, how best the G20 countries can cooperate better for the better uses of all this technology and the use of space and cleaning up the debris and all of these things. But I wonder if you have any idea, as presently now as the chairmanship of the G20, of how this cooperation could go forward. And secondly, what about the non-G20 countries? I mean, obviously, there's a lot of this technology that is of benefit for everybody around the world. So how, will this cooperation would also incorporate the needs of, the global South and even the non-global South to benefit from what's happening now in the space economy? Thank you.
I think this is a very good point and very important point that you are making, and I would like to get views of other dignitaries present here on what they think. Because it's something that I've been thinking about through the presentation also, and one of the slides that was shown was almost saying that every country must be autonomous and have all capacity, have soft and hard capacity, have technology and have political autonomy, which almost goes against cooperation, right? So how do you cooperate? And we have to realize that it's not a zero-sum game. If you think of it as zero-sum game, then of course cooperation will not be that easy. So any views that anyone has on this point, very important point that is raised here? Anyone has a view? Yes, please.
I can share one experience I had, which is the design of joint satellites with India. And actually being from different sides of the globe allows you to have a relative autonomy in having one satellite for using the satellite on the European region, for example, for us, and using the satellite on the Indian region for India. Still, we have cooperated, we have built it together, we have developed it together, each of us has paid half of it. But in reality, in operating it, you feel very much autonomous. So that's just one example.
Anyone else? Okay, any other point anyone wants to make? Even from anyone else in the room? Yes,
well,
please.
My point might not be very sophisticated, but I think there is an area which it is linked to the use of the information that is already there that could have a big benefit on the general public, and that's an area that's not fully being tapped. I remember on an Argentinian cooperation project, and actually it increased productivity in developing countries from 8 to 12% in the agriculture, just by having that cell phone, being able to know when you could plant and when you could sow, and the information was free and public. And if the farmer would have that the capacity to read that, if he sowed 1 week later or one week before, it made an impact. And I think there's a lot of a large area that we can tap in disseminating information.
Yeah, sorry.
I agree with you that if everybody becomes self-sufficient to do all those activities, there is no reason for a cooperation. But in space, I think that's not the case. We have definitely rooms for this cooperation. And I would like to suggest is related to Earth observation. We build satellites which goes around the globe and is never for one nation. It collects data all across the globe, And if you have the ability to download the data at appropriate places, then it can be useful for everybody. So one of the things that we can do amongst G20 nations is to create an infrastructure in each of the nations for those satellites which belong to another nation to image and download the data in those particular nations. Of course, it involves certain operational part of it which can be managed. But if you create a body which will look at the Earth observation cluster of satellites that each one of us have launched, and where all the potential to image your nation and share this data through a ground infrastructure without loading the other nation's infrastructure, it can be mutually beneficial. I think this can be considered, and I will be very, very happy from whatever satellites that we have in India can be put to best use of other nations, provided you have an infrastructure to image it and download the data in each of your nations. We have really constrained by the downloading capability that we have in India, that we are unable to support other nations. And if that can be created, it will be one of the big things that we do for our Earth observation constellation.
Yeah, that will definitely be path-breaking in a sense if all the countries cooperate on sharing data download, because all of us are generating our own data. And as Mr. Somnath said, that if we can do it, that'll be great. But just going back to your point, undoubtedly the big payback of space technology is from things like this. And in any agriculture economy like India is, if we can increase even 3 or 4% the productivity, it makes a huge difference. And a lot of things are happening right now, but perhaps there is a lot more that can be done and needs to be done to fully leverage that. Again, any other thoughts anyone has? Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. This is just to talk about autonomy versus, the cooperation.
Can you keep the mic closer? Yeah, keep the mic closer.
So I just wanted to extend what Secretary Department of Space told.
Dr. Chauhan,